The young and the restless spoilers. As the sultry summer heat settled over Genoa City, the winds of allegiance began to shift in ways no one had fully anticipated. What began as a seemingly routine return to familiar chaos quickly unraveled into a treacherous web of decisions, tests of loyalty, and unexpected seduction. At the center of it all was Phyllis, always the wild card, always the disruptor, and this time she wasn't just playing for attention. She was playing for legacy, for relevance, and perhaps most of all, for survival in a world that no longer offered second chances so easily. Her decision to align herself with Cain, a move that initially appeared transactional and devoid of personal investment, would spark a series of confrontations and recalibrations that would leave deep fractures across the landscape of Genoa City's already fragile relationships. Phyllis had convinced herself it wasn't betrayal, it was strategy. She wasn't switching sides, merely pivoting toward opportunity. Cain had promised her something others hadn't in a long time: power without strings, a voice in shaping something new, and above all, a fresh arena to prove herself in a town that had long grown weary of her games. She didn't hesitate to accept his offer. And why should she? In her mind, she owed no one loyalty but herself. That belief became her armor, her justification, as she paraded her newfound confidence with the smug satisfaction of someone who had already calculated the fallout and deemed it survivable. Nick, however, saw through her. He knew Phyllis better than most, perhaps even more than she wanted to admit. And what he saw unsettled him. It wasn't just the sudden shift in her professional alliances. It was the glint in her eye, the rehearsed nonchalance, the way she laughed a little too freely when Cain's name was mentioned. He had sensed it before others had even realized the lines were being redrawn. For Nick, the warning signs were not just about Phyllis's betrayal, they were about the ripple effect that her decision would cause. Because in Genoa City, when one person shifts allegiance, others inevitably follow, or fall. He confronted her with an ultimatum that was less a demand and more a reflection of disappointment. He wanted her to choose friends or strangers, history or ambition, truth or convenience. And yet he knew, perhaps before the words even left her lips, that Phyllis had already chosen. She had chosen herself. And that, to Nick, was more damning than any direct act of disloyalty. For someone who had spent decades weaving herself into the lives of others, Phyllis now stood apart, indifferent to the damage she might leave behind. But it wasn't only Phyllis who was playing dangerous games. Across town, Audra was orchestrating a different kind of conquest, one woven not through corporate maneuvering, but through subtle glances, calculated vulnerability, and perfectly timed moments of presence. Her target was Kyle, a man torn between longing for stability and a subconscious craving for chaos. Audra had seen that flicker in him, the hunger he tried to suppress beneath layers of fatherhood, legacy, and unresolved bitterness. She leaned into it with expert precision. She wasn't chasing romance, she was chasing leverage. And Kyle, despite his better judgment, was slowly slipping into her rhythm. But something unexpected happened. While Audra's attention was fixed on Kyle, others began to take notice of her, particularly Lily and Damian. To them, Audra represented a variable, a potential disruptor or ally, depending on how she could be swayed. Her boldness intrigued them, especially as Nate's name lingered in the background of every conversation. There was something transactional yet tantalizing in the idea of Audra becoming a piece in a larger puzzle. One that involved reclaiming power, exacting revenge, and shaping the future of Chancellor Winters and beyond. Damian, new yet already formidable, saw in Audra not just a woman using seduction as a tool, but a strategist willing to gamble everything for influence. Lily, always the diplomat, viewed her with caution but not dismissal. She knew better than most that underestimated women often became dangerous assets or unrelenting enemies. And so, as Phyllis embraced her alignment with Cain, becoming more emboldened in her disregard for the judgments swirling around her, Audra became the unwitting axis of multiple ambitions. Each move she made toward Kyle, each calculated flirtation, had echoes in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. What she didn't fully anticipate, however, was how quickly attention could shift from attraction to scrutiny. The more she tried to win Kyle over, the more she invited analysis from Damian, who began to wonder if Audra could be shaped into something more useful, or something more threatening. Lily, meanwhile, watched from a distance, cataloging Audra's interactions with a patience born from years of watching people rise and fall on the promises they couldn't keep. Back at society, Nick sat alone after his conversation with Phyllis, the weight of her refusal to choose hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't just about business. It was about history. About memories that still whispered through every corner of Genoa City. About people who had stood by each other through deaths, resurrections, betrayals, and broken promises. To see Phyllis drift into the arms of someone like Kane, a man who, despite his own complicated past, was now building something that felt both opaque and precariously ambitious, was a sign of the shifting sands beneath everyone's feet. Nick's frustration wasn't rooted in jealousy or even a need for control. It was fear. Fear that people like Phyllis would become so entangled in their need to stay relevant that they'd forget who they once were. Fear that old alliances meant nothing in a world that now thrived on reinvention over redemption. He wasn't naive, he'd made his own share of compromises. But there was a line, and he feared Phyllis had crossed it with too much ease. In the coming days, as whispers of Phyllis's loyalty to Kane spread and Audra's entanglements with Kyle deepened, the broader landscape of Genoa City began to shift. Victor, ever the puppet master, began quietly gathering information, sensing that Kane's moves were part of a larger design. Nikki grew increasingly anxious, intuiting that the storm brewing had less to do with business and more to do with the erosion of trust across multiple factions. Abby, watching the dynamics evolve at society, began to question who was truly in control and who was merely pretending to be. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, alliances were less clear, smiles less genuine, and every handshake carried the weight of suspicion. Phyllis entered the room dressed not just for business but for war, smiling, composed, and unapologetically smug. She had survived worse, after all. And if aligning with Kane meant a path forward, she would take it. Nick, watching her from across the room, understood then that the version of Phyllis who once stood by him was gone. In her place stood a woman reborn in ambition, shielded by self-interest, and armed with a dangerous new set of allies. Meanwhile, Audra stood at the edge of two competing paths, one with Kyle, promising a volatile connection tied to family wounds and lustful missteps, and the other with Lily and Damian, promising power, structure, and a seat at a different kind of table. Her next move would determine whether she remained a tempting distraction or evolved into a decisive player in Genoa City's next great war of influence. And in the quiet between meetings, between drinks poured at society and secrets whispered behind closed doors, the city held its breath. Because in Genoa City, choosing a side was never just a decision, it was a declaration. And for Phyllis, for Audra, for Nick and Kyle and the rest, that declaration had already been made. The consequences would only now begin to unfold. Audra had always known how to command a room, not with volume, but with precision. Every glance, every slight lean-in, every choice of words had purpose. So when she turned her attention to Kyle, it wasn't just flirtation. It was strategy. A calculated move in a city where personal intimacy often translated into professional leverage. She saw in Kyle the flicker of rebellion still alive beneath his polished veneer, the part of him still raw from heartbreak, still uncertain of where he stood in a world that had spun too quickly beneath his feet. She tapped into that uncertainty, not with overt declarations, but with presence, steady, warm, subtly provocative. It worked. Or so she thought. What Audra didn't expect was how quickly that quiet pursuit would draw eyes not of admiration, but of suspicion. Lily, watching from a calculated distance, read between the lines that Audra didn't bother to write. It wasn't the flirtation that bothered Lily, Genoa City had thrived on far worse. It was the timing. The precision. The sense that Audra wasn't chasing a man, but tracing a pattern. one that could interfere with the tentative peace Lily had built around the people she cared about. And Damian, though newer to the tangled politics of the city, wasn't blind either. He appreciated Audra's role in softening his edges, in helping bridge a gap between himself and those whose bloodline and choices had defined parts of his identity he was only beginning to accept. But appreciation didn't mean trust. Not yet. And certainly not when Audra began playing a game he hadn't agreed to. There was something about Audra's insistence on proximity to Kyle that unsettled Damian. He couldn't name it at first, but it lingered, like a splinter beneath the skin. Nate's name, still fresh in his mind, became the lens through which he watched Audra's every move. Her connection to Nate wasn't just history, it was a reminder that emotional ties in Genoa City were often weaponized. And Damian, still navigating the fault lines between vulnerability and protection, felt the urgent pull to act, not out of jealousy but defense. If Audra was capable of blurring lines with Kyle, what might she do with Nate if the opportunity resurfaced? For Lily, the concern went deeper. She'd seen too many women in the city wrap themselves in ambition and leave behind scorched relationships and fractured companies. She didn't dislike Audra outright. But she didn't believe in her either. Not as a team player. Not as someone capable of loyalty when the tide shifted. And so, quietly but firmly, Lily and Damian began watching Audra, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Unbeknownst to Audra, her moves were no longer private. Her conversations with Kyle, once seemingly innocuous, were now being interpreted through a filter of caution and control. Every laugh, every gentle touch on the arm, every lingering eye contact was catalogued and analyzed. And though Kyle remained oblivious to the growing concern around him, the air around Audra had already changed. She was no longer simply a woman making bold moves, she had become a variable in a much larger equation. Meanwhile, across the city, Phyllis walked into her own storm with the kind of high-heeled confidence that bordered on recklessness. Her alliance with Kane, once a quiet arrangement sealed in whispers and mutually beneficial ambition, was beginning to look more like a spark near dry grass. The closer they moved toward visibility, the more cracks began to appear. Phyllis, emboldened by her belief in reinvention, began moving too quickly. She talked when she should have listened. She smiled when she should have waited. And most dangerously, she underestimated the optics of her actions. Those watching from the sidelines, Nick, in particular, saw the unraveling long before she did. While Phyllis basked in the glow of a perceived rebirth, her alignment with Kane was being reinterpreted as desperation masked as strategy. Nick warned her, not just with words but with absence. His silence, his withdrawal, spoke volumes. She had expected resistance, but not abandonment. And in that vacuum, she doubled down. She couldn't afford to question her choices. Not now. But Kane, though initially impressed by her enthusiasm, began to see the volatility simmering beneath her ambition. Phyllis wanted too much too soon. She didn't just want a role, she wanted control. And in a partnership as fragile as theirs, that imbalance threatened to collapse the very scaffolding they were building together. Kane, ever the pragmatist, began to wonder if aligning with Phyllis was a mistake, if her penchant for chaos would sabotage the foundation before they'd even finished laying it. It wasn't just about one bad meeting or one reckless comment. It was about patterns. Phyllis, for all her brilliance, was unpredictable. And unpredictability had a cost in Genoa City. A cost Kane was no longer sure he wanted to pay. He began taking calls without her, crafting plans that subtly excluded her input, testing the waters of separation without declaring it. Phyllis noticed, of course. She always noticed. But instead of retreating, she grew louder, sharper, more insistent on her place at the table. And that insistence, rather than reinforcing her value, exposed her insecurity. Back in the orbit of Chancellor Winters, as Lily and Damian narrowed their focus on Audra, a quiet decision began to form. Sometimes, protecting power meant preemptively neutralizing threats. And Audra, despite her charms and usefulness, had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't yet war. But it was no longer peace. And if she noticed the chill in Lily's tone or the pause in Damian's replies, she didn't show it. Or perhaps she did, but, like Phyllis, chose to pretend it meant nothing. But nothing in Genoa City meant nothing. Every silence was loaded. Every smile was laced with meaning. And as the weeks unfolded, it became clear that both Audra and Phyllis were dancing on the edge of knives, one with seduction, the other with defiance, and both with the growing realization that the alliances they had formed might not hold under pressure. Whether Phyllis would unravel her alliance with Cain before it truly began, or whether Audra's unwanted attention would spiral into something more dangerous, remained to be seen. But the tides were shifting, the board was realigning, and no move went unnoticed. In Genoa City, ambition always came at a price, and sometimes, it was the very people who reached for power that ended up buried beneath its weight.